Hello, my name's Vince Sheehan and today I'd like to talk about Back to the Future, the 1985 Robert Zemeckis film starring Michael J. Fox, Christopher Lloyd, Leah Thompson and Crispin Glover. I'd like to talk about this film. It was recently in the cinema again and I saw it actually when it was originally released back in 85 as a kid. And I have to say it's one of my favourite films ever. It's just such an entertaining film which you never get tired of watching. I must have seen it countless times. But I'd just like to talk about how this film's put together in terms of its structure, of the plots, and also in terms of some of the themes it communicates. Now, Back to the Future, you could say, is in 5 acts, really, with a brief introduction and a brief coda. In the introduction of this wonderful scene where Marty, this teenager, comes to his friend, the eccentric Dr. Emmett Brown's house, and he plugs in this guitar with this massive speaker. And it's such an unforgettable opening scene of this film, and just the sheer power of the speaker pushes him back, over into the wall in the sofa. So from the beginning of this film, it's just so entertaining. And then you see him over the unforgettable Huey Lewis and the News song, The Power of Love. You see him going to school, kind of hitching a ride to the back of cars on his skateboard. And then that introduction takes us to Act 1. And Act 1 is really Marty getting to know him a bit more, who he is in 1985. We meet his family. His dad, George, is this rather henpecked and put upon character, is quite pathetic, and his mum's this kind of slightly overweight lady who's clearly likes her drink. We hear about his uncles in jail, and they're not perhaps the most successful family. And we're introduced to Biff as well, who's this kind of bullying character. He bullies Marty's dad, George, mercilessly. And we get to know Marty, and when we finally get to meet Dr. Emmett Brown, and he's invented this time machine using stolen plutonium. And the joke of the film is he's chosen a DeLorean car, which was much criticised when it was released, as his time machine. It was kind of a bit of an in-joke there from the mid-80s. And Dr. Emmett Brown demonstrates this with his dog Einstein, this machine. And but then the terrorists come, whose plutonium it belongs to, and they shoot Dr. Emmett Brown. And Marty, in sheer shock and panic, jumps in the car and he races off. And that brings us to Act 2. Marty has gone back in time 30 years, same place, exactly the same place, but back in time. And he's now in 1955. And Act 2 really is about Marty finding his way in the 50s, 1955, the shopping mall where he drove the time machine, the car, all of a sudden is now just loads of fields. And he crashes into this barn, and he's chased out of there by the farmer, Old Man Peabody, and his family. And Marty makes his way to town and hides the DeLorean. And it's here in Act 2 that Marty meets his dad from 30 years before, and his mum as well. And his mum seems to have taken a bit of a fancy to him. He's knocked over by a car and she takes him in, and it should be Marty's dad, George, who's knocked over, but it's Marty instead, and she kind of fancies him. And then Marty meets Dr. Emmett Brown in his house in 1955, and Dr. Emmett Brown vows to get him back to the future. In Act 3, it centres around Marty's efforts to get his parents back together, because he's beginning to realise that if they don't get together, he is erased from history, him and his family, and he has this little photograph with him. And sure enough, people are beginning, his brother and his sister are beginning to disappear. And Marty would be next. Marty has several run-ins with Biff as well, who's just as kind of odious as he is as he is as an adult, and his bully goes round making George's life a misery. But Marty's trying to convince his dad to kind of get a bit of a backbone and to ask his mum out, etc. The doc also, Dr. Emmett Brown also finalises the plan to get Marty back to the future. There's no plutonium to get back, but there's this lightning strike which Marty knows is going to happen. It hits the clock tower in the town square, and this is enough energy to get Marty back to the future. And he has this. The doc's made this wonderful model of the area demonstrating this experiment, and the car goes off. The little toy car goes off and sets light. Act 4 is really about Marty getting his parents back together. He's got this plan with George that Marty's going to pretend he's going to kind of act in not a nice way to his mum, Lorraine, and George is going to come and be the hero. But it turns out that Biff arrives, and it's Biff who starts kind of hassling Marty's mum, and then George arrives and knocks Biff out. And then we were in the dance where they'll get together. This is the big dance, the Enchantment Under the Sea dance, where Marty's parents get together and they fall in love. And so Marty's got to make sure that this runs smoothly, but, well, you know, the guitarist injures his hand and Marty gets on stage and he starts doing the Chuck Berry thing. It's so entertaining, this film. And every time George lacks confidence, Marty begins to lose control over himself because he's beginning to be erased from history. But George really mans up here and he gets together with Lorraine. And finally, as well, in a very exciting sequence, Marty manages to get the DeLorean running and hits, when the lightning hits the clock tower, he just gets it just in time and he's managed to go back to the future after many mishaps, such as the cord being stretched and coming out, etc. And then we're into the final act, which is very short. Marty's back in 1985 and he sees himself run away from the terrorists, but he also sees Dr. Emmett Brown killed. Well, he thinks he's killed, but it turns out that Dr. Emmett Brown read this letter Marty wrote him back in the 50s, warning him what would happen, and he's wearing a bulletproof vest. And then we have this coda where we see how life is now different in the 80s for Marty and his family. His dad's now this successful, well-dressed author. His mum's very slim and active, and his parents are very much in love. His sister and his brother are a success, you know. And Marty meets his girlfriend as well, Jennifer, and he has this dream car he's always wanted. But then the doc comes back from the future because he's been going off himself, and he says, "You've got to come with me, your kids are in trouble." And he says those famous lines, "Where we're going, we don't need roads," and the car lifts off and off it goes. So Back to the Future, that's the structure of the story. It's such an entertaining, well-directed, ingenious story, really, because even after you watch this film 10 times or whatever, you notice little details about how the past links to the present, and you notice little kind of details in the script which really give it this sheen of quality in this film, and the way it's directed is so ingenious as well. It really is a masterful blockbuster. And some of the themes it covers, it's a very light-hearted film, it's certainly not a serious film, but if you could travel back in time, should you play around with events, the doctor's very worried about reading this letter because he knows that might change the course of history, the letter which Marty wants to warn him about, him being shot. So it raises a couple of interesting questions. There's also this kind of unsettling question about, this kind of incestuous attraction between him and the younger version of his mum, There's this idea also of this kind of 50s science fiction Americana running through, which is really enjoyable as well. And yeah, it's just a really entertaining, fantastic film. And I've just included just a brief slideshow with some of the themes and the structure after this. Thanks for watching. Bye.